We are recording.
Wait, hold on. Restart. Do, 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 do. Welcome to another D3 Datacast. We started the week with a bonus episode. We're going to end the week with a bonus episode. Consider this part 2 of the deep dive we took with the NCAA tournament bracket, looking at the first round matchups. Here we want to zoom out a little bit and use some similar analysis methods to look at the bracket as a whole to see who are the favorites to come out of the opening weekend, who might be the favorites to advance to the Final Four. Ultimately, let's look at those championship odds. How are the odds seeing who are the favorites to come out as the national champion? But before we do that, Matt, we want to take a moment to recognize everyone who's joined us over the last couple days. It's been great to see the response we got to the episode looking at the first round matchups. Of course, a special thanks goes out to Pat Coleman, giving us the front page treatment on d3hoops.com. So the support from the whole D3 Hoops community has been amazing. Let's keep it going. If you haven't subscribed, click the subscribe button so that way you'll be sure not to miss an episode, even when Pat doesn't put it on the d3hoops.com front page. Although, Pat, hey, anytime you want to give us the front page treatment, we're down for that.
Open invitation. For sure, there's a lot of great D3 Hoops content out there. It starts and ends with d3hoops.com with Hoopsville. The QCast is great. Other teams have had shows as well, the Twitter accounts, D3 Bubble, etc. So just love to hear all the D3 voices, the stuff that Scott and Riley have done with their site, with their live stream that they did, and their women's basketball analysis and content has been great as well. Zach, you're absolutely right. This ends the week in Division III basketball. There's nothing interesting in D3 basketball after this episode. So it's all about the predictions and computer projections. And then you might as well not even play the games because, the computers have spoken. Not really, but let's go over and let's maybe take a look at some of these odds. We went through the first round matchups, like you said. So today we're going to go a little bit deeper, do some Final Four type predictions, see what the computer sees for Fort Wayne and beyond. So heading into the data, let's see if I can get my slide to switch over. There it goes, the Randolph-Macon Quadrant. Zach, I don't know how you want to go through these necessarily. So maybe just go through the screen and what we see from kind of left to right there.
Yeah, so in the previous episode, like you said, we went through the first round. So this expands it to look at who the favorites are to come out of the opening weekend pods, and then round by round. So not surprisingly, as we saw previously, Randolph-Macon's an overwhelming favorite to beat Wilson in the opening round, but they're a pretty overwhelming favorite to come out of that pod, regardless of what happens in the other game between Scranton and North Carolina Wesleyan. We also noted last time that Oswego State has been a really strong team according to your computer ratings, your efficiency metrics all throughout the season. And we noted how interesting of a potential Sweet 16 matchup Randolph-Macon against Oswego would be. Here, we see they're just about as big of a favorite to come out of their pod as Randolph-Macon is in theirs. And what's really interesting is if you follow that out to the right, percentage to win the championship. So to win the national title, you see Randolph-Macon with a 20.5% number there. Oswego State, 12.2%.
Yeah. That's
amazing considering one of these teams isn't even going to be able to advance to the Elite Eight. With the course that they're on, assuming as we project that they will be coming out of this weekend, they're going to be meeting in that first game next weekend. That's huge.
Yeah, the computer obviously thinks whoever wins that potential, not a given matchup, but a potential matchup between Randolph-Macon and Oswego State would be a big favorite for the rest of the tournament from that kind of standpoint of a relative evenness. Now it sees Randolph-Macon as number 1, but they're Oswego State number 3. I think my computer efficiency ratings likes Oswego State a little bit more than anything else. I think the human voters had them around number 6 this week in the top 25 poll. I think they're right around there in the Massey ratings as well. But here at number 3, that would be a challenger for a Final Four spot as well. And to be in the same kind of Sweet 16 portion of the bracket as Randolph-Macon, that's a potentially big matchup right there. And that Oswego State odds really even surprises me, even if you look at their own first round pod with John Carroll. we kind of talked about that in a seeding wise being potentially like a 4 or 5 could go either way type of a thing. John Carroll, in our last episode, we mentioned that for whatever reason, the efficiency ratings does not see them as that kind of like top 15, top 10 type team like they've been in the human poll for the last most of the season, I guess at this point. So that'd be really interesting if John Carroll is um, you know better than that. If Oswego's a little worse than that, then those odds shift dramatically. We also talked about that John Carroll matchup with Albertus Magnus being pretty even by these computers, but maybe that's in actuality like a 70-30 matchup. Who knows? So yeah, the odds can swing very a little bit wildly depending on how a system likes a team or doesn't really like a team in certain ways. And also interesting to see another example of how like the efficiency ratings views of teams differs from the NCAA seeding criteria version of a team kind of ranking, and to see 3 teams in the top 5 being in this quadrant. We haven't talked a little bit lower, but Johns Hopkins there at number 5. This is going to be a strong quadrant for sure. Some very strong teams. For some extra context on championship percentage, I think if you had taken only the top, if you say only like the top 16 teams have a chance, no one else below that has a chance, which isn't true. But if you said that, then each of those teams would have about a 6% chance to win. If so, that's kind of like a top 16. If you had only a 16-team tournament and they're all even, it would be about a little bit higher than 6.25% to win. So a team right around that kind of line is, I guess that contextualizes a little bit. But to see Randolph-Macon at 20.5%, that's a big number. It's not as high as they were last year going into the tournament, when I think it was around 25% or so. But yeah, Oswego State, that's kind of like a top 8 tournament type of a random odds there. So that's a big number for Oswego State. And that's kind of one to keep an eye on. How can the Lakers do? Can they get out of the pod against maybe a John Carroll, and how far would they advance with a potential matchup with Randolph-Macon just, the next weekend?
Yeah, it's just amazing to see those big numbers like you mentioned, because Randolph-Macon and Oswego State can't both advance to the Elite Eight. Someone's going to knock out the other, and whoever
Yeah.
comes through that is then going to be picking up a lot of championship odds as a result of getting through that game.
Yep.
All right, so let's move a little bit more to the bottom half of this quadrant. We talked about an even matchup between Hamilton and Montclair State. Johns Hopkins, another team that the computer really likes, giving them solid 70% odds to come out of this weekend, and then pretty close to 50-50 to get to the Elite Eight. In the other pod that's going to be hosted at Case Western Reserve, you look at some of these numbers and the way that the bracket shapes up, you would think of Case Western as a 2 seed.
Yeah.
But really, the way that the computer sees it, they're like the 4th best team here, and you see that reflected in some numbers that aren't quite as strong. This looks like probably out of the top seeds that we've talked about, they're going to have the hardest time coming out of this first weekend, and then probably being an underdog, assuming they face Hopkins in a Sweet 16. But then when you get beyond that, it's really all about who wins a potential matchup between Randolph-Macon and Oswego State.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was interested to see the numbers for Hopkins. I had called out kind of the 6% line as being kind of a top 16. They're right below that 5.7. So they still have really good odds to get, all the way through. But yeah, the case pod is really interesting. The computer favors Whitewater over Wabash, gives Case kind of like a 60% chance to get out of that weekend. I see Case Western as a team whose odds have a chance to go up greatly if they can get through that first weekend. Obviously a matchup with someone like Johns Hopkins would be difficult, and you maybe have Randolph-Macon and or Oswego State down the road, but that's a ways down the line, and we know upsets are going to happen, and chalk's not going to just hold. So you get through your first weekend, maybe you beat a Wabash in the second round or a Whitewater in the second round, and then you could be looking at, if we reran the odds at that point, maybe Case is up to that kind of 6%, 8% range. Who knows what that will necessarily look like?
It's interesting to see a lot of big numbers here, all in one quadrant. I think, not to get too far ahead, but I think you really have to look at this as the most top-heavy quadrant there is. So some pretty tough draws. if you're looking at a case or even Randolph-Macon as a top overall seed, there's some real competition for them in this quadrant. But whoever comes out of it is probably at that point the tournament favorite.
Yeah, I think you're right about the top heavy nature, especially if one of those favorites comes out. I don't know that this is like the strongest overall top to bottom quadrant, but I think as far as like top heavy nature, top 3 or 4 teams that are in this 1/4 of the bracket, I think you're right here that this is the most top heavy version of that.
All right,
And
let's move.
we should also clarify one thing. These odds are obviously rounded. When you see a 0% on here, that's not like literally no chance. It's a rounded odds. Feel free to screenshot this lull at D3 Datacast when your team makes it through. There's going to be a lot of upsets. So like 1% chance we made it through, like whatever. Like yeah, that happens. We know that. This doesn't say teams have 0 chance. This just means the probabilities get lower, obviously, as it goes on, and it's probably like point something, not 0. Just
Yeah,
wanted
we
wanted
did
to say
take
that.
the final championship odds out to an additional decimal place, but everything before that, you're right, is just rounded to the nearest whole percentage.
Makes it more
Um,
readable.
right. And of course, just because something is maybe unlikely to happen does not mean it cannot happen.
Right.
That's the other thing to keep in mind here. All right, let's move on to the Rowan Quadrant. Here we see a much different picture. If you go over, let's just start all the way at the right. The odds of a champion coming out of this, you really don't see anything that jumps out. Wisconsin Oshkosh is the top number here at 3.6%, which is interesting to note because they are not the team seeded by the NCAA to have this quadrant built around them. That's Rowan. That's why this is the Rowan Quadrant. And not only that, but they're not even on the opposite side of a quadrant from Rowan. But Rowan is a solid favorite in the first round, as we noted. They are the favorite, but just a 56% odds here to come out of the opening weekend, which is maybe a bit surprising. Wisconsin Oshkosh, obviously a much stronger favorite at 76%. And then really interesting to see 42% and 42%, North Park and Wash U. Now, we pretty much know at this point this pod should have been by seeding at North Park, but it will be played at Wash U because of the geographic considerations. Sewanee can drive to Wash U, so that saves a flight. But that puts a road game in North Park's way against Wash U, when really by seeding it should have been a home game. And again, assuming North Park gets through and Wash U gets through. And the other thing that I saw that was really interesting to highlight here is you look at the pod at Mount Union. The computer really likes NYU and has them as the slightest of favorites to come out of that Mount Union pod.
Yeah, the computer has liked NYU rather largely all season since the end of their non-conference slate. Even though they were kind of more of a middling team in the UAA, it didn't really hurt them that much because we know the UAA is a strong league. So when you're playing other good teams most nights in conference play, even if you win those games, great. You take a close loss in those games, it's not probably going to drop you too much because the computer says you performed as well as another good team, let's say. So it didn't really drop them. I think 9's pretty high. Obviously the human voters, I don't vote them in my poll that high. So that might be a team kind of like the reverse John Carroll, where the computers maybe too high on them and they're not that strong. So maybe give more of an edge to Mount Union than you see here on the screen. But who knows? That's why they play the games, as the kids say. So we'll have to see what happens in that pod potentially. I do think this quadrant overall is probably the weakest quadrant in terms of average rating. Maybe there's one more that's similar, but part of that might be Fontbonne and Sewanee like drag down the average rating just by those two schools a little bit. But you don't really see those top 5 teams in this quadrant like we had seen before by the efficiency ratings ranking. These teams are kind of more like the teens, right? Teens and 20s are kind of the better teams in this pod outside of maybe NYU. But yeah, seeing UW Oshkosh getting what looks like as favorable of a draw as anything, I think that is interesting compared to what we had seen on the last slide when we saw a few really good teams getting most of the chances to come through. You can see your chance to get to the Final Four. There's a lot of teams that could do it and no overwhelming favorite. Maybe UW Oshkosh is the biggest number there, but Rowan could get through, WashU could get through, NYU could get through, Mount Union could get through, and probably more likely than that, we're going to see someone that's listed here with a single-digit percent get all the way through to Fort Wayne, and that would be tremendous to see.
When we were going through the first round matchups, we noted the tempo metric for each team. And so just going back to that potential matchup between Oshkosh and Rowan, that's one to point out in contrasting styles. Rowan plays at one of the fastest paces that we have in the tournament. Oshkosh, pretty typical Wisconsin team, likes to play at more of a deliberate pace. So, the computer likes them in this matchup, but, in terms of a actual, real watch the game matchup, it's really interesting because it's definitely going to be, or would be if it happens, a real contrast in styles that makes it a must watch, even beyond just kind of the headlining nature of these names and where they've been placed in the bracket.
Yeah, another thing that's interesting to me here in this quadrant, if we look at the bottom half there, the WashU / North Park pod and the Mount Union pod, the second weekend, if chalk holds in those two pods, or not the second weekend, the second day, the second round, that's going to be a bunch of kind of just like 50-50 toss-up matches. I guess I said a bunch. Two 50-50 toss-up matches there. It would be great to see WashU and North Park battle it out, NYU and Mount Union battle it out. I think those would be fascinating. Anyone's game in either of those, and then whoever gets through, we're going to probably see another even matchup in the Sweet 16 between those teams as well. So I think I really, really am interested to see what happens in particularly the bottom half of this quadrant here, just because I see some very evenly matched teams, which will make for some great games in my expectation.
Yeah, definitely. You look at those Sweet 16 odds to win the Sweet 16, you see a lot of even numbers with 16, 20, 31 being the highest, and 26 there. So that bottom half of the bracket is definitely one to watch for what should be really good games and tight matchups.
And again, we're talking about favorites mostly. That doesn't leave out the chance that a
Sure.
could beat WashU and North Park. Like that's I'd be surprised if that happens because you expect WashU and North Park to beat Co. But we've seen Co beat some really good teams in the American Rivers Conference this year and get through the tournament of the American Rivers Conference. So, they absolutely could get through. 32% chance of beating WashU, 14% chance of beating, the North Park Sewanee winner. Maybe we're seeing Co in the Sweet 16. Definitely not out of the question, even though that they have a lower odds than the other teams there. That's not zero. That's a 14% chance for Co to reach the Sweet 16, and that's pretty high.
All right, let's move to the other side of the bracket. The quadrant built around Swarthmore as what we interpret to be as the number 2 overall seed, although the computer sees them as the 12th ranked team entering the tournament. But that being the case, their numbers are looking pretty strong to not only get out of this round, but well, I guess a matchup with Keene would be really good. But they're definitely one of the favorites out of this quadrant, and even with some fairly decent odds to win it all at 3.4%. And then getting down to Keene, again, it's another situation where the biggest numbers are in the top half of the bracket. So really, that's looking forward to the potential of a Swarthmore Keene State matchup, and then whoever would survive that would become kind of your overwhelming favorite out of this quadrant, like we see with Oswego State and Randolph-Macon on the other side of the bracket. But yeah, both Keene State and Swarthmore hosting, and both 69% chance to escape this opening weekend. And really, what would be a really interesting and highly anticipated game in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, a potential Keene State Swarthmore matchup would be tremendous. I think Keene State is the example. We've talked about this with other examples, but they're much more loved by human voters and the computers than the NCAA criteria because they weren't able to put together a good NCAA strength of schedule number or a bunch of regionally ranked wins by the NCAA criteria. But according to who they've played, who they've beaten, the margins they've beaten them by, the computer sees them as one of the strongest teams in the country. So they're probably, like, if you look at seeding versus true strength, if they were 1 through 16 in this quadrant, they might be they would be the 4, I believe. Yeah, I think that's how it would break out. but they're sixth best in the country. So really interesting to see potential for Keene State to get through. A matchup with Swarthmore would be very, very tough for both teams. And I think the winner of that is obviously the favorite then to reach the Final Four, given the strength of the top half of this quadrant versus the bottom. But yeah, just interesting to see how some of the things break down. Again, differing from how the NCAA seeds them and how the teams are actually maybe viewed by computers or human polls. Big example of that, Stockton down at the bottom, kind of like the number two-ish seed. I know the Division III doesn't really do it that way, but you can kind of think of it that way. They're a host seed. We saw Rowan on the previous slide anchoring a quadrant. The NJAC teams were able to put together very strong resumes that got them highly seeded by the committee, but based on the criteria, using the criteria, I think that was fair. But the computers don't necessarily see them as elite teams. So you see like a number two seed being like the 50th best team in the country. So that makes this whole quadrant kind of wide open, but also a little bit weaker when you look at absolute strength of teams compared to maybe the first quadrant we had seen for sure.
And you talk about that difference just between different ways to evaluate teams, and it's interesting to go through this bottom half of this quadrant. Look at Middlebury, 16% chance to win Elite Eight. So if you're looking at all the teams how they stack up right now, the computer has Middlebury as a favorite, um, uh, at least out of this part of the quadrant to reach the Final Four. Or maybe a better way to say it is to come out of this bottom half. You look at the 34% number, so that makes them the favorite out of these 8.
Yeah.
But take what we know and what we've seen. We talked in the previous episode talking about first round matchups that if Rochester gets through Nichols, that sets up a potential rematch from the regular season against Middlebury, and it was Rochester who won that regular season meeting. And then you go down to the other pod where Mary Washington is a favorite at Stockton. Mary Washington, of course, being the only team to have beaten Randolph-Macon this year. So you see, Middlebury by the numbers here is the favorite, but you start working through some of the other things that we know about these teams and what we've seen, and the picture is very, very murky. So it's, I think you look at Rochester with a 50-50 game and in round one and being a fairly controversial pick to even make the tournament due to a low overall winning percentage. But I don't think anyone would be surprised if they were the team that made an Elite Eight run out of this part of the quadrant. So really interesting stuff to see. You mentioned Stockton, but hey, they'll be playing games at home, so that could help carry them a little bit. A lot of intrigue here. I don't. It's interesting to see the numbers. I don't know that it really gives us all that much of a picture to really hang our hat on, though.
Yeah, I had to call out in the first quadrant we talked about, the Randolph-Macon Quadrant, that 0% doesn't mean 0% because we started to see a whole bunch of them. This quadrant doesn't have a lot of 0% at any point. You even looked at the chances to win the first round. So to get out of the first weekend and reach Sweet 16, even Baruch has a 1% chance of doing that, which seems low, but compared to other regions, to have your lowest rated team in the whole quadrant have like a rounded to the nearest percent chance of getting out, I think is significant. You even look at chances to win the Sweet 16. There's not a whole lot of low numbers there. I think this whole quadrant is anyone's game to a large degree. And I think particularly as you called out, that bottom half of the quadrant, like exactly as you said, if Rochester loses their first game, I would not be surprised. If Rochester gets to the Elite Eight, I am not necessarily surprised. So there's a whole range of outcomes for a whole range of teams in this quadrant based on just like some general evenness. And that's been a talking point of the Division III season all year, that we're going to see some odd things come tournament time because Nichols is going to play Rochester in the tournament, and maybe we're used to seeing the CCC winner and a UAA Pool C team and that being a mismatch. But I don't know that that's a mismatch this year. And this is the type of thing that we were talking about, and the type of thing that makes like a quadrant like this and a tournament so exciting, is that I see a wide openness across this kind of corner of the bracket.
But like we saw in the Rowan Quadrant, there's not really a team that jumps off the page in terms of overwhelming championship odds. Keene State would be the closest here at the 6.3%. That's basically right in line with what you were talking about in terms of if you have a 16-team field and everyone had even chances. That's basically the number it would come out to be. But the second highest here, Swarthmore, at just 3.4.
Yep. Yeah. So really, whoever gets through this, well, first of all, a lot of those odds are baked into, like we said, just unknown who's going to get through. So you start accumulating those odds once you make it through. It's not saying once you get to the championship game you can't win it. It's just
Right.
there's more of a balance at that point, or up to that point. So it's less clear who's going to win games because there are fewer overwhelming favorites. So I think that's something to keep in mind. These teams can get to Fort Wayne, and once they get to Fort Wayne, well, I mean, it's how a tournament works is that someone will get through. So I just had clarify that. But these teams can all win it because like a Keene State, like a Middlebury, we've seen them beat top teams throughout the year, and whoever gets to Fort Wayne just because this is the weaker quadrant doesn't mean that they're out of the mix.
Right. They do play the games. And so what we might have as a 50-50 game or a 60-40 game does eventually turn into a 100%, 0%, and we adjust from there.
Yep.
Okay.
So I guess one way to think about that even is if a first round matchup is 50-50 and you win that game, you can just offhand double the odds going forward because half of the reason it was halved was because we didn't know if you were going to get out of your first game. So, I mean, just an easy way to think about these close matchups. They win. If Nichols beats Rochester, all of a sudden they have close to a 44% chance, maybe not exactly that, but close to that going forward to win the next game, just because of the fact that they had beaten Rochester and that was a toss-up.
Yeah, quick rule of thumb, you basically steal the other team's odds to add to your own, right?
Yep.
Not exactly like that, but that would be the easiest way to think about it.
Yep.
All right, let's move on to the final quadrant here, the Christopher Newport Quadrant. And it's the Christopher Newport Quadrant, but let's jump all the way down to the lower right here with the second biggest number we've seen. And that is, actually, I'm sorry. This is actually the biggest number we've seen. 22.1% chance to win the championship, Matt. Your efficiency ratings computer, like St. Joseph, actually as the tournament favorite, despite the fact that they are not the team selected to have the quadrant built around.
Mm-hmm.
That was Christopher Newport, who has pretty solid championship odds themselves at 5.9%. But so, Matt, you just want to talk to that to start, your feelings on St. Joseph being your number one odds team?
Yeah, that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they're not the number one team in the country, even by this computer ratings. So to see them have the highest odds kind of was interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the path, right? We talked about that with Randolph-Macon having to get through potentially Oswego.
Right. And then the second thing that was interesting to me is if you just look at average efficiency margin for a quadrant, this is the highest rated quadrant in the entire field. But I think it's more to do with a bunch of teams kind of in the top 100 or even in the top 50 range, and not necessarily that it's top heavy. So maybe that metric is a little misleading because there's a bunch of teams kind of like even looking at top half. 4 Christopher Newport, 8 Hampton-Sydney, 25 Emory, 32 St. Thomas, Texas, 30 East Texas Baptist, 26 Mary Hardin Baylor. There's a bunch of teams like we had talked about in the previous quadrant who can get to the Sweet 16, who can get to the Elite 8, who can get to the Final Four through that one. So Christopher Newport being the top seed, number 4 in the efficiency ratings, if they can get through to the second round, they're probably going to have a tough matchup. If they get to the Sweet 16, they're probably going to have a tough matchup. Elite 8, they're probably going to have a tough matchup. And when you get to that point in the tournament, to some degree, you do expect that. But there's not really a game here, except maybe Farmingdale, but even that one's not going to be a cakewalk. But there's not really a game here in which Christopher Newport is just going to be far and away the favorite. I don't think. So that makes their odds a little lower. St. Joseph, on the other hand, the way the bottom half of this quadrant looks, you can see some of the numbers elevating a little bit. 57 Carleton, 81 St. Norbert, 19 Wheaton, but 44 Illinois College. So that pod there at Wheaton has good teams who can win games, but it's not the same as we're seeing the computer thinks that some of the pods in the upper portion are necessarily. Pomona Pitzer is one of these teams the computer sees as number 88. Did they come into the top 25 in this week's human poll? I think they did actually. So they're a team for whatever reason the computers don't see as highly as the human voters did. And I just checked, yeah, it's 25 for Pomona Pitzer. So maybe that's pulling the numbers way down for St. Joseph. You see Williams there as number 11 by the efficiency ratings. That's probably in a general range of where the human voters have had them mostly, although I think they fell a bit recently. So a second round game with Williams could be difficult for St. Joseph. That would be a losable game. But other than that, if Pomona Pitzer wins, the computers really like St. Joseph. Whoever comes out of the Wheaton pod, the computers will favor St. Joseph. And then just being the highest team in this quadrant by the computers, again, if they were to get an Elite Eight game, they would be a favorite there. So I was surprised to see it until I started looking at the paths, looking at their half of the quadrant and seeing, other than a couple of teams here or there, the computers aren't really overly enthralled with the other competition they might be facing. So it's just like, they're the favorite. We talked about Christopher Newport having difficult matchups in the top. St. Joseph will have probably more friendly matches on average each step of the way if they can keep winning games. That doesn't mean they will, but even from that first game in 99-1 rather than a 90-10 makes a difference once you start talking a few spots down the line that you're starting with a 99%, not only a 90%. So just I think it's about the path for St. Joseph that on average their likely path is going to be just a little bit easier than some of the other teams, even than Randolph-Macon, who we saw being the number one rated team by this computer ratings.
You talk about the balanced nature of this quadrant, and I think that there's probably some teams that are capable of making a run to the Sweet 16, or if you told me they were in the Sweet 16, wouldn't be surprising, but have a chance to lose here in the first round.
Yep.
Right. So
Yep.
you look at some of these matchups that are fairly even. Like if you told me St. Thomas or East Texas Baptist came out of that Texas pod, I don't think that would be a surprise. Obviously, Mary Hardin-Baylor is also a contender to come out there, although they have what is looked at as an easier first round matchup.
You look at
Carleton and St. Norbert, it's a 55-45 there advantage for Carleton, but by the time you match them up with Wheaton, who knows? So I think that there's going to be a little bit of I don't know actually how much sorting there will be after you get through the opening round, because I think that there's going to be a lot of situations where you have fairly competitive games leading into more fairly competitive games, and it's not so much that you're expecting pod hosts or favorites to be advancing here.
Yeah, that whole Wheaton pod, those first round games are basically 60-40 or closer. 62-38 is the Wheaton game. Wheaton's the 1 in that pod, and Illinois College is the 4. But Illinois College, the computers say they could easily get past Wheaton, and then they're probably the nominal favorite in the second round game versus either Carleton or St. Norbert on the neutral court. So Illinois College, who's the 4 in their own pod, could very easily reach the Sweet 16, 21% odds. That's these are it's basically a coin flip pod to some degree. You flip 2 heads in a row, good. Illinois College is in. Slightly lower than that, but not much. So I think we also here see a lot of great, interesting matchups. Going to see some carnage. We're not going to see chalk get all the way through, but you're right. You wouldn't be surprised to see a St. Thomas and East Texas Baptist, a Mary Hardin-Baylor, a St. Norbert, a Carleton in the Sweet 16 and beyond. Something like that's going to happen, and we shouldn't be all that surprised about it.
Yeah, it's hard to even define what chalk might be, right? I mean,
sure, right.
There's a whole host of situations where I don't think any of them would be a surprise. I mean, even look at Christopher Newport as the top seed by the NCAA in this pod. If they have to play a second round game that is a true road game against Hampton-Sydney,
right.
No one would be surprised, I don't think, if Hampton-Sydney won that game, right?
That'd be like an even matchup.
Yeah, right. It sets up an even second round matchup for the team that was the top seeded team in this quadrant. And then you're talking about a basically 50-50 chance that they don't even come out of the first weekend.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, that wraps up our quadrants, Matt. Are there any high level thoughts that stick out to you that we didn't get through along the way?
We talked about it in this quadrant. St. Joseph's 22% odds to win the championship was probably the single most surprising number to me. Was also a little bit surprised to see how high Oswego State came out. I know the efficiency ratings had been liking them, especially in recent weeks, climbing all the way up to number 3. But being kind of in that same portion of the bracket as Randolph-Macon and still coming out with 12% odds, that means the computer likes if Randolph-Macon either loses before them or loses to Oswego State, then the computer, likes Oswego as much as anyone. And that'll be interesting going forward. But I'm just really interesting to see once the games start to be played, obviously, how they shake out. There's always a game or a couple of games where it's like an 86-14 Mary Hardin Baylor Shriner where the Shriner wins, and that's just the nature of sports. That's the nature of basketball. When you have 32 games that have some level of evenness, like a NCAA tournament has, you're going to get, the expectation is by the mathematical odds that a bunch of these upsets will happen because you roll the dice a whole bunch of times, and you're going to roll some ones, you're going to roll some sixes, you're going to have snake eyes pop up. So that those things happen just because the odds show low doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means it's less likely to happen over a course of simulations, right? But the weird things can happen. They do happen. That's why we love the games.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about a total of 32 first round games, you only need 1 out of 32. That's a very small
Yeah.
overall,
Right.
chance. You just need 1 out of 32 to have something crazy happen.
Even if, and I didn't just calculate the numbers, but even if they were all 90-10 matchups, you
Yeah,
if the 10% happened, then you'd say, oh, look, the computers were wrong. No, the computers would be more wrong if all the 90% happened and none of the 10% happened because they're expecting some of the time these 10% are going to happen. That's how odds work. So we do expect to see some of these low percentages hit because we're throwing that every time a game happens, we're throwing that random number generator out there, and when the wheel stops, that's the result, right?
absolutely. So, Matt, we don't usually do a mailbag when we do a bonus episode, but we did have some things just with the kind of. This has been a huge week, obviously, and also with this topic, it gave us a chance to revisit a previous mailbag question we had because it leads in perfectly. We addressed this initially about a month ago when friend of the program, Scott Peterson, asked us what value of N would make you put 50-50 odds on winning the title, top N teams in the field. Basically, how many teams would you need to be able to put in a basket before you felt like you had a 50-50 chance of the team in your basket was going to win the title? And so people can go back and listen how we answered that question a little bit more theoretically, but now having gone through this, we can answer this more directly in terms of this tournament with how we see it setting up. So actually, I was a little bit surprised to see the results here, at least based on the efficiency ratings, because parity has ruled the day. And I think we talked about this in our initial question a few weeks ago when we had this in a mailbag. Is when you have a season of parity, maybe a flatter picture, you'd expect that you'd probably need more teams in that bucket to feel like you had 50-50 odds because it's more uncertain as to who would come out. Yet, as we just discussed, if you take the top 3 championship odds, St. Joseph, Connecticut at 22.1%, Randolph-Macon at 20.5%, and Oswego State at 12.2%, that gets you above the 50% threshold. Now the Massey ratings also runs these kind of bracket analysis similar to what we just went through, and we didn't take the overall look, but just as a matter of comparison, that number is a little bit different with Massey. Massey does see Randolph-Macon as the overwhelming favorite at 24.5% odds to win it all. So actually a little bit greater than either of the top 2 numbers based on the efficiency ratings. But after that, it's much more of a wide open picture. With the second highest odds being Wisconsin Oshkosh at just 8.5%. So there you need a few more teams to fill that bucket before you get over the 50% mark. And there it turns out to be 5, with the top 5 being Randolph-Macon, Wisconsin Oshkosh, Christopher Newport, St. Joseph, Connecticut, and Swarthmore. And there, I think that's a little bit maybe
Yeah.
more what you expect. I think it's surprising, as we went through to see you get over 50% just with Randolph-Macon and Oswego State being 2 of the 3. And
Mhm.
like we said, they're going to meet in a potential Sweet 16. Only one of them can even advance to the Elite 8.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at how it's broken down with Massey, you got Randolph-Macon as the overwhelming favorite, which speaks to Massey's confidence in Randolph-Macon as the favorite in that quadrant. But then you only get repeats within a quadrant with Christopher Newport and St. Joseph, who could only meet up in an Elite Eight matchup to advance to a Final Four, with Swarthmore and Wisconsin Oshkosh being in opposite quadrants. So here you actually have 4 quadrants represented, and 5 teams overall.
Yeah, the biggest difference, the most striking difference, is the difference in odds for St. Joseph. 22% on one and 6% on the other. And we talked about how the St. Joseph path is probably making a big difference for them. The potential first round game with, what was it, Pomona Pitzer. I think Pomona Pitzer is a lot higher on the Massey ratings than on my efficiency ratings. So that would start dragging down St. Joseph's odds a little bit. Probably some other teams are like that if we wouldn't have did a full analysis. And if you just start tweaking numbers and tweaking team strength, even though they're the number 2 team, I believe, still on both systems, St. Joseph is, Massey must see the path being a lot more difficult for St. Joseph than my numbers do. It's probably just because some teams are tweaked up or down here or there. And so instead of, in a 75-25 matchup, maybe it's more like 65-35 or 60-40 a few steps down the line. And when you start kind of going through those percentages, it can make a big difference. Surprised it makes that big of a difference. So I'll be interested to see what happens. But yeah, I was definitely expecting this to come out more like the Massey ratings, where maybe not even a 24% team out there, but maybe a couple of 15% and then like a 6% and a 5% or something like that is kind of what we expected. But yeah, it's interesting that it kind of matches last year by, I think we said the efficiency ratings and the Massey ratings both said about 3 teams last year got to that 50-50 odds point. And that's kind of what the efficiency ratings say again this year, is if you take kind of the 3 favorites. Surprising that 2 of those are in the same quadrant. But that's how it came out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
So now to the official mailbag questions that came in. This comes from Drew Latrenta, replying to our call for mailbag questions previously. So yes, he was late for that, but hey, there's always another mailbag, so we're picking it up now. How do you think the whole bracket changes if Barry is in the SAA Pool A, another flight? And the additional context here is Barry lost the conference championship game to Sewanee, who is within driving distance to Wash U. So that's why that pod, which should be at North Park, gets moved to Wash U. Sewanee can drive there. But the problem, as Drew noted with the screenshot here, is that Barry to Wash U is 503 miles, which is above the 500-mile mark that the NCAA uses to designate a flight. So it would not be as simple as just saying, swap Sewanee out, swap Barry in, because it doesn't work that way. That would be a flight. Now we should note also, they could not get to Hampton-Sydney. That I think was, I pulled that up, I think 525 miles. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, you move someone out of Hampton-Sydney and send Barry to Hampton-Sydney. So the first thing that came to my mind, and Matt, I know you've done a lot of bracket analysis, so I'll let you address it as well. But the first thing that came to my mind is, if it suddenly becomes that Barry needs to be a flight, I think what we don't see is the West Coast teams being flown east. I think under that situation, maybe there's a pod at Pomona Pitzer, so Pomona Pitzer and Cal-Lu stay local. Whitworth could get flown to Pomona Pitzer. Barry gets flown to Pomona Pitzer. Now, I think there's problems with that just in terms of the overall wonkiness of seating, but we know that travel is a big constraint in Division III and the bracketing process. So while Barry gets added as a flight, you remove first round flights for both Pomona Pitzer and Cal-Lu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what we're talking about is a flight for Barry. The only place they can get to, the only team they can get to who was in the field was Emory, I believe. And then Emory can't make a whole pod around them based on who else is in the field. I don't believe. Well, actually, you probably technically could make a Barry, Emory, NC Wesleyan, Hampton-Sydney pod. It's kind of a weak pod, so you could do that. I think that does maybe work geographically if I have NC Wesleyan and Emory correct. So that maybe is a possibility. I think for sure the Wash U pod goes back to North Park. So just to address that goes back to North Park. They host pod there. I think Sewanee beating Barry definitely did shift that pod. And I think Sarah more or less confirmed that on Hoopsville that was a geographic thing because of Sewanee. What we lose is the kind of handy nature of Christopher Newport not being able to host because their women's team is hosting, being able to host at Hampton Sydney, that Emory can get there and we can build that pod. We'd have to send Christopher Newport somewhere else if we wanted to do that kind of Emory, Hampton Sydney, Barry, NC Wesleyan kind of a thing, which maybe closely works out by seeding if Hampton Sydney is close enough to be your nominal host, even if they don't get the hosting priorities, whatever. So that's an option. Or I think I like your California option if we reduce flights. I think you get down to, what would that have been, 2 flights? Just Whitworth and Barry maybe have been the only 2 flights needed in the first round. Maybe you do 2 Region 10 pods, and then you can, because you only use 2 flights, maybe you can use one more to flip a SCIAC and an ASC team or something like that. So you're still at kind of like 4 flights, but you're balancing the bracket a little bit more. I don't know if they have the ability to do that. So I think you might be right that we would have either seen, we could have seen a California pod and use that flight that direction. We maybe see the Emory pod play out. I think it's probably one of those 2 scenarios. Either way, it opens up a Midwest pod probably. Well, if we did the Emory thing where Barry goes to Emory and Christopher Newport goes elsewhere, whatever, we probably open up a pod which would have been at the Wash U, now shifted back to NPU area, where maybe a West Coast team flies in to the Midwest rather than going all the way to the East Coast. That could have happened. So there would probably have been cascading ramifications down the bracket. But I think it would have been either Emory pod or it would have been California pod, most likely, as being kind of the main shift.
All right, next mailbag question comes from Pat via YouTube. Now, I don't know for sure, but my guess is this is not Pat Coleman of D3Hoops.com. But Pat says, would you consider changing your possession adjustment to something more reflective of the average number of possessions in a D3 college basketball game, say 70? 100 possessions doesn't really mean much because there are hardly ever going to be that many possessions in a regulation game.
Yeah, so last episode we went through kind of all the first weekend matchups and looked at teams' efficiency ratings and their offensive rating and defensive rating. And there I report numbers on a per 100 possession basis. So the question is here, since 100 possessions doesn't happen, maybe a few, I don't even know, could a system game get even that high? I'm not even actually sure. I have to go back and look. 100 possessions doesn't happen. Average is about 74 possessions per game. Should I change those rating numbers? And so instead of per 100 possessions, it's kind of like on a per game, per average game basis. It's something I've thought about. But more what I've thought about of doing is just doing it per 1 possession rather than per 100 possessions. And then you can just kind of, it still isn't like a natural number because you'd have to kind of multiply by expected possessions. But that's kind of what you have to do anyway. There are teams that, I guess most teams probably play within like a 66 to 80 possession window. So yeah, if you did kind of like a per 72 possessions or per 74 possessions average, then for most teams that would work out. But for extreme teams like system teams, you'd still have to do wonky math to turn that into kind of a real number for them. The other thing I like about per 100 possessions is that it turns out that average is basically a point per possession. So like for 100 possessions is almost exactly 100.0. So it can kind of turn into like an indexed number, like you might see in baseball, of like OPS plus or whatnot. So like 100 is average, 106 is 6% above average, 110 is 10% above average. So you can kind of think of those efficiency ratings naturally as indexed numbers, indexed to 100, so that you can kind of see what percentage above or below average they are on each side of the ball just by looking at it. So an 80 defense is 20% better than average, essentially. So I haven't done that. I think if I made a change, I would probably change it just to points per possession. But really, that's just moving the decimal place. So in the end, I've kept it at 100. And another big reason is since I mirrored this off of the D1 Ken Palm ratings, he uses per 100 possessions. So if someone was used to looking at D1 or like to look at D3 and D1, it's the same kind of a system, and they should kind of match with each other. So it is something I thought about doing, something I haven't done yet. I just since it's about like 74-ish possessions, I feel like that also there would be some lack of cleanliness in doing that, because then you'd have to kind of take those possessions back out in some way to kind of do the math and compare. But it's a good question and something I have thought about.
All right, our last mailbag question today is, Matt, you tweeted about, well, previously we've talked about, it feels like there's maybe a tipping point coming in, or at least a lot of discussion among stakeholders about, is the process that we're currently using to select and seed teams the right way to do it? Are there better ways to do it? It seems like a lot of people are ready to have that discussion. And one of the things that came up recently in a Hoopsville interview between Dave McHugh and Megan Wilson, the committee chair on the women's side, was I guess there's been some talk at the championship committee level about pairwise. And pairwise rankings are used in hockey already. And so I guess the discussion is, should that be expanded beyond? Now, that's something. So anyway, you tweeted that about that, and that you're, I don't know exactly what your initial thoughts were, but that you're more optimistic about it now, and you're hoping to dig into it a little more just to see what kind of results it might turn out. And so Max Fan at Go Maccabees on Twitter asked you or us to discuss this on the next episode. So we'll pick it up in the mailbag here. So just to kind of get a common understanding of some terms here, pairwise is a method for ranking teams in which basically you're creating pairs. You're evaluating a team against one other team, kind of one at a time, and it spits out a number that says, okay, you win the matchup over 30 teams, and someone else might win a matchup over 40 teams. And so basically you're ordered based on how many matchups you win against other teams. Now, the way that it's implemented in hockey currently is that those matchups are evaluated in terms of 3 criteria: RPI, which for those not familiar with that is a amalgamation of winning percentage and strength of schedule that puts those things into a single number. So it's RPI, it's head-to-head results, and it's results against common opponents. So in a pairwise system, those 3 things would be evaluated. Let's say your team comes out ahead in 2 of those, and the other team has an advantage in 1 of those. You win that matchup. So that gets added to your total. You beat this team, and then however many teams you beat in that kind of one-on-one analysis, that leads to your pairwise score. Now, so it's important to note, pairwise is a ranking method. It's dependent on how you define your criteria. Currently, as it's implemented in hockey, they have defined their criteria as RPI, head-to-head results, and results against common opponents. It doesn't have to be that, but that's how it's been defined. And so I think from the basis of starting this conversation, if that's the way that the NCAA is using it in hockey, that's probably a first way to evaluate how they might implement it in basketball, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the criteria.
Yeah. I think that's going to be the big important thing, is what does the criteria become? What does it change? And is it addressing what we want to address? Logan Hansen, who does the Hansen ratings for like D3 football, he had a kind of tweet to this effect on the day we're recording this earlier on. So I'm just kind of reference that. And he said if the problems with the current system are essentially that we think the criteria aren't the right criteria, then just popping those criteria into pairwise isn't going to help you, because you're going to kind of have a garbage in, kind of garbage out situation. And I 100%. I agree with that. So if we think results versus regionally ranked opponents is carrying too much weight, or strength of schedule is carrying too much weight, and we just pop all those things into a pairwise, it's still going to come out and say the team with the highest strength of schedule kind of wins that part of the matchup, and the teams with the best results versus regionally ranked opponents, however that's defined, wins that matchup. I think so. My original thing like a week ago was I think it would be a bad system for D3 hoops. I think if they just popped the current criteria into pairwise, I think that would be bad. One of the reasons is strength of schedule on its own means 0. So like whoever has the highest strength of schedule, if you win a matchup with strength of schedule, like what does that mean? You had the highest strength of schedule. Did you win any of those games? It doesn't say. It'll evaluate winning percentage too and give you a kind of a win-loss and how many matchups did you lose. But I just think that what we really want to do, or maybe what the discussion is right now, is are the criteria correct? And I think it's more still about evaluating what criteria we want to use than whether or not we want to do kind of a committee evaluating those criteria or a pairwise. I think the advantage of pairwise over committee is it makes sure that those criteria are mathematically evaluated in the same way across the board. No matter how much a human committee tries to do that and talks about we want to be consistent with the criteria, it's just humanly impossible to do that because of a variety of things, right? If you think of a difference between a 499 strength of schedule and a 501, it's really hard to get across that, like, it starts with a 4, rather than a 5. And if you're talking about a 550 versus a 552, you see those as, oh, those are like the same. So there's just some biases and just cognitive things we would have to get over when we're evaluating it, kind of on a human level. You put it together in a computer system, then you get a number, and that number would be consistent no matter what types of teams you're evaluating across the board. So I think that is helpful. It'll save the committee some kind of amount of work. They can focus on other things like bracketing or whatever, but they won't have to figure out like the regional rankings because the pairwise would come out. I think where I would be not optimistic is if we just took the same criteria, shoved it into pairwise, and say, here's your answer. And there was some indication that they had shown the committee maybe one set of example pairwise rankings and things were almost the same. If they had just run the criteria through the pairwise system, that's what I would expect, right? The committee's doing a good job of evaluating criteria and evaluating consistently among themselves. And so pairwise would probably come back and say, yeah, these are the teams that had the best winning percentage, the best strength of schedule, the most results versus regionally ranked opponents. So, but it doesn't necessarily prescribe, you know, well, I guess if you use an RPI number, it would say this is what we're always using to compare strength of schedule and winning percentage together. But if what you wanted to do is change the criteria, then let's focus there before we worry about is it a pairwise system or a committee system, because we want to make sure that the inputs to the pairwise system are the best inputs that are possible. I think that's even more so than running like the criteria, unless they switched it up and said this is what it would look like with the hockey criteria. This is what it would look like with the current basketball criteria. This is what would look like with some other criteria we might have invented, or using non-conference strength of schedule as one of the inputs or whatever. I think we want to evaluate those underlying criteria more than just is a pairwise system better than a committee system or not.
And if going to a pairwise system necessitates going to an RPI to help bring strength of schedule and winning percentage together, is that I would argue let's bring RPI into it, but use RPI to define what is a good win or a top game, as opposed to being dependent on who happens to be ranked or who happens to not be ranked, and also have the problem of that data having to lag a week. Hey, let's just go to a top
Right.
75 RPI. The top 75 are the top 75, and use that to go in, divine as your a replacement to results versus regionally ranked. The other problem is if you kind of noted this, if you move to a pairwise system, you lose some of the nuance that they currently have using if they were going to put results versus regionally ranked into a pairwise system, you lose some of the nuance that they use, where they're looking at, okay, was this a win over a top team within a region? Because I would imagine a pairwise just had to say, nope, this is 4-2, this is 2-5, 4-2 is better, right?
Or it would use some sort of a point system, like a point versus a number one, a point versus different number of points for a number two, or like minus so many points for a loss, or whatever. You'd have to do some sort of system like that rather than just probably a straight percentage. But again, that's the discussion of what does that mean.
So hopefully that answers the question. It's not quite as simple as saying, yes, we're going to pairwise, because within that, there's a lot to get figured out. Now, again, the way that it's been implemented in terms of being used in hockey is it's about RPI, head-to-head results, and results versus common opponents.
And I would like to try to use my data in the coming weeks, maybe after the tournament, to try to run it through the hockey method to see what that looks like, because that kind of just strips out results versus regionally ranked opponents, which is a little bit nebulously defined, I think maybe intentionally by the handbook, so that the committee can maybe look into those results. I think there's still maybe some definition needed on what that means. But yeah, I would like to look at the data and say, using the hockey method, what would pairwise kind of come out to be, and see what that turns out.
So that's the end of the mailbag, which wraps up this week, or this episode. I think it does wrap up the week in terms of content from us. So at this point, all we need to do, Matt, is sit back and watch what we expect to be a really great opening weekend of the Division III tournament. And we'll be back taking a look at the second weekend next week. In the meantime, if you have anything for next week's mailbag, any questions, any comments, anything that you'd like to see us address, please leave a comment here. You can also find us on social media at facebook.com/D3Datacast and at D3Datacast on Twitter. send us a message there, and we'll pick it up, get it compiled, and try to come up with a fairly decent answer for you in next week's mailbag. Other than that, Matt, I think we're out. Just invite everyone to connect with us on social media, and we'll be watching the games. Let us know what you're thinking, what games you're watching, how you're going to be experiencing the tournament, because it should be a good one.
Yeah. Until next time, enjoy the games and good job, team.